ulama that you'll find differences of opinion about, like Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Arabi, the famous philosophical Sufi, who was also a muhaddith and a mufassir, like Ibn Taymiyyah, who was a muhaddith and a mufassir. These were actually encyclopedic giants in terms of the actual amount of information that they had amassed in the religion. But you'll find ulama differ about them. So some ulama will say that Ibn Taymiyyah is a kafir, and then other ulama will say he's Shaykh al-Islam. Some ulama will say about Ibn Arabi that he's Shaykh al-Akbar, and then other ones will say he's a kafir. So you'll find this in the tradition. You'll find these splits. With those type of imams, generally the Ahlus Sunnah tended to avoid them. You will find areas where they were greatly honored, but overall their books were not read a lot. Now, in the case of Ibn Arabi, I think he did have quite a following in the Ottoman tradition, and certainly in Syria he had a lot of followers, and in Iran, oddly enough, the Iranians honor him largely through al-Qashani's work, because the Irfani tradition that's there uses him. So my point being is that you're going to find the imams that people differ about, and then you'll find the ones. Now, Abu Hamid, to be fair, there was some difference early on. There were ulama that rejected him, like Imam al-Maziri and Abu Bakr al-Tartushi, Sidi al-Harazim. The ummah pretty much agreed upon his imamah. They called him Hujjat al-Islam, the proof of Islam. And so the idea now, because you have groups that attack him, historically he was not attacked. He was really honored in the community. Some people considered him weak in hadith, and towards the end of his life he started reading hadith quite assiduously. But prior to that, he was more known for his fiqh and for his tasawwuf. So his tazkiyah, which is the ihya. And he's considered a mujaddid by, I mean, the ulama, as far as I can tell, they're pretty much agreed upon that he was the mujaddid of that period of time that he lived in, and his effects still go on. And so my point being that you will find differences of opinion. And those that are agreed upon, they also are under the microscope. So not all of their opinions are taken. And over time, they'll look back and scholars will say, well, he was wrong here, or he was wrong there. So it's not like everybody, just because they reach that level, that they're not open to criticism. They are. And they will be criticized. Some of their opinions will be challenged by later scholars. During their lifetime, generally, the ulama say, they call them, Imam al-Qarafi mentioned, I think, that the fuqaha were like tuyus ala zariba. They're like goats fighting over the garbage heap. There's a lot of hasad amongst scholars, which was traditionally why contemporaneous scholars did not bear witness against other scholars. You have to really kind of wait to see what the ummah says down the road about them, because their contemporaries will often be against them simply because there's sickness in the souls, and they have hasad, and the ulama themselves have those sicknesses. But over time, those greats become part of the canon, and their books enter into the canon. And this is why you will find certain books are studied over and over and over again throughout history. And those are the most important books to read, because they're given a tawfiq, and they're given an honorific position in the library of the Muslims. There are many books in Arabic grammar, but for some reason, the foundation is Sibawayh's book, and from Sibawayh comes the great abridgments that are studied later, like the Ajurrumiyyah for basic grammar, the قطر الندى ملحة الإعراب لامية الأفعال in Sarf, and then the Alfiyah of Ibn Malik in grammar, and Al-Awamil al-Mi'a. In Balagha, there's certain books that were read consistently. In logic, certain books like the Shamsiyah and the Sulam of Akhdari. For some reason, they just spread all over the Ummah, which was nice because when somebody like Ibn Arabi, to use as an example, somebody like Ibn Arabi, who was trained in Andalusia, and most of his shuyukh were in Andalusia, he comes to Konya, and he ends up giving khutbah and teaching and marrying in the culture here. His son-in-law, Sadruddin al-Qunawi, was one of the great muhaddithin of that time. Al-Ajluni said that Ibn Arabi was considered a thiqah in hadith during his time. So his hadith were sound. The point being is that you could have somebody from a completely different culture in Spain come to Turkey and they fit right in with the ulama. It's really something stunning about the Islamic civilization. And so if you go, for instance, I studied largely with Mauritanians, but the books that I studied, when I meet people from the Deoband Madrasa, they studied a lot of the same books because they're in the same tradition. And even if they aren't the same books, the subject matter is so similar that we know the same technical vocabulary and we can communicate about these things, because usul al-fiqh, it differs a little bit in the Hanafi as opposed to the Shafi'i or the Maliki usuli tradition. There's some differences in the mustalahat, but overall it's very similar. And so what's happened in the modern period, and this in essence is a kind of Protestant impulse, which is the idea of going back to the original sources, of bypassing tradition, of going back to the Quran and the Sunnah. And this is a kind of chant that modern Muslims have. Now, part of the problem with that is the Quran and the Sunnah are in language. And language, by its very nature, has the problem of ambiguity, all language. I can use a term, and you can understand one thing, and I mean something very different from it. And so this is a problem. And this is why defining terms was so important in our tradition. There's a whole slew of literature which is called al-ta'rifat, al-hudud wa-ta'rifat, the tradition of definitions and terms. I mean, there's so many books on this subject. One of the most famous is Al-Jurjani or Ibn Fawrak. But these books were foundational books because there are words that are used that you have to understand them if you're going to understand the Hadith or the Quran and the books of the scholars. So learning these things was very important, and that's the basis of communication, is that we're speaking the same language. If our language differs, then our communication is going to break down. Whether it's two different languages like Turkish and English, there's almost no communication. But even within the same language, if we're using terms in a different way, it's going to break down, which is one of the reasons why in adab al-bahth wal-munadhara, it's the right of your interlocutor, whoever you're engaging with in a discussion, it's the right of the interlocutor to ask for a definition. It's a right. So any word you use, the person that you're speaking with, you can say arrafhu, yani how are you defining that term? And the definition of a term is done through the 5 predicables. So that's a whole other subject, because you have to study that to do al-bahth wal-munadhara. So in saying that abrogation is a major problem in our community, the real problem is not so much abrogation, but it's people that are unqualified that are taking the Quran and the Sunnah into their own hands and not understanding how subtle these things are. That even naskh in itself, and we assert as Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, all of us, we assert naskh. It's part of our tradition to believe in abrogation. It's one of the things. that the Jews and the Christians differed about, because the Christian tradition, the New Testament, abrogates a lot of the Old Testament. And the Jews rejected the idea of abrogation. One of the things about the Quran is it comes as a muhaymin. It's a guardian of the previous dispensations. And so it will often clarify debates that they were having amongst themselves. And this is why the Quran will take positions. For instance, in the seven sleepers, the Orthodox tradition, they put them in their canon of saints. So they are considered saints in the Orthodox tradition. The Catholic tradition doesn't believe in the seven sleepers. They say that it's an apocryphal tradition and it doesn't have validity. The Quran sides with the Orthodox tradition on that issue, and basically argues that the Catholics made a mistake on that one. They missed them. So this is the abrogation is asserted in the religion, but the meaning of abrogation and the idea somehow that abrogation can completely nullify verses in the Quran, this is where you're going to get the khilafat. Some see the abrogation as a takhsis, that yukhassis, that it's really making specific things that are general, or that the tadarruj of a hukam. So for instance, in wine, in the alcohol, it's not so much naskh as tadarruj, that the Quran is taking people by degrees, going from a society that imbibes a lot of alcohol to a society that's free of alcohol. And instead of doing it all at once, it does it over a period of time. So each of those verses, it relates to a specific time period. So these are the issues. But the point of, ayatul sayf, which is in Tawbah, and also the verse in Surah Muhammad, that to argue that these verses have abrogated all of the Meccan verses is completely insane. And this is one of the things that you will see people that really hate Islam. This is one of the key issues that they focus on in their books. What they say is Muslims will go to interfaith conferences and they'll say all these wonderful, beautiful ayahs, but what they're not telling you is all those ayahs were abrogated. This is a very common motif in anti-Muslim writing. And they'll bring our own sources. You see, they'll bring our own sources and they'll say, here it is right there. Look, Imam Suyuti in Al-Itqan, and this is considered a valid book in their tradition. In the Al-Itqan, he says all these verses have been abrogated, and the Quran itself says that مَا نَنْسَخْ مِنْ آيَةٍ وَنُنْسِيهَا نَأْتِي بِمِثْلِهَا بِخَيْرٍ مِنْهَا أَوْ مِثْلِهَا. We don't abrogate an ayah or cause it to be forgotten, except that we bring better than it or its like. And then Allah is saying this is a demonstration of His qudra. Right? So they'll use these arguments. And Muslims, unfortunately, we have to be more aware of our own tradition in that way to be able to defend ourselves. Because the ahkam that were revealed in Mecca, these are universal. This is universal virtue. And to say that these are abrogated is to argue for the abrogation of makarim al-akhlaq, which many of our scholars have said, including Tabari, including in the earliest tafsirs, this is mentioned. But in relation to power, the Prophet ﷺ is powerless in Mecca, and he has power in Medina. وَلَا حَوْلَ وَلَا قُوَّةَ إِلَّا بِاللَّهِ. I mean, these terms are tricky terms, because they're people love these, modern people love these power. It's all about power. And our tradition is a tradition of divestment of power. But God gives power and enables people to do things. In reality, the power is His alone. But He does enable people to do things. This is the istita'a. And so there are people over other people in this world, and they have power over them. They can exploit them. When you're in power, a certain set of rules applies to you that does not apply when you're not in power. And a lot of the problems that come with abrogation relate to this fundamental problem, that for an average Muslim, all those Meccan verses should apply to him. But for a government, you don't forgive people if they wrong other people. But if you're wronged yourself, it's a high thing to do to forgive other people. And the Prophet always forgave unless it was a haqq of Allah. In his personal haqq, he always forgave people. He forgave the woman who poisoned him. And that's warada, the sunnah, that he forgave her in his haqq. If there is a qisas in that situation, it was because of the sahabi that died from the poison, according to the ulama. But in terms of his haqq, he forgave her. And there are many examples of that. And in the end, if you take anything that's harsh in the Quran, you have to relate it to the Prophet, وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَضًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ فَبِمَا رَحْمَةٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ لِنْتَ لَهُمْ. It's a mercy from Allah that you were made gentle. His nature was gentle. Right? And had you been, low here is حرف امتناع امتناع, it's impossible. وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَضًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ لَنْفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ. They would have dispersed from your presence, like people that flee. If you see people fleeing from people claiming to follow the Prophet, just know for certain that they're not following the Prophet. Because the Prophet's way is a way of attraction. It's not a way of negation.